The worst part wasn't the pain. It wasn't the cold of the hospital floor when her legs gave out, or the sound of the monitor flatlining for 11 seconds before the crash team brought her back. The worst part was the window. There was a small rectangular window in the door of the trauma bay, the kind with wire mesh embedded in the glass, the kind that's supposed to be too small to matter, and through it, in the pale fluorescent light of the corridor beyond, Margot Beausoleil saw a woman she recognized, tall, dark coat, the kind of highlighted hair that takes $200 and 3 hours to maintain, standing with her arms crossed and her chin tilted up, watching the chaos on the other side of the glass and smiling. Not a worried smile. Not a please God let her be okay smile. The kind of smile that belongs on someone watching a stock they shorted finally crash. Margot had been in that emergency room for 4 hours already. She'd come in at 2:17 in the morning after collapsing at home. Severe internal hemorrhaging from an ovarian rupture that had been misdiagnosed as stress the week before. She'd been alone when it happened. Her husband Declan was at a work conference in Calgary, or so he'd said. The doctor's name was Dr. Kwame. He had calm hands and kind eyes, and he told her very clearly, later, that she had been unconscious for 11 seconds, during which her heart had stopped producing a viable rhythm. 11 seconds. In clinical terms, she had died. She didn't remember those 11 seconds. What she remembered was everything before and everything after. Before the pain, the lights, someone cutting her clothes away while she tried to say her husband's name. After waking up in a recovery room with an IV in each arm, her younger sister Bia sitting in the chair beside her, holding a paper coffee cup with both hands like it was the only solid thing left in the world. "Hey," Bia said. Her voice was carefully controlled in the way voices get when someone has been crying for a long time and has run out of tears. "Hey, you're back." Margot tried to speak. Her throat felt like sandpaper. "Don't," Bia said. "Just don't talk yet. Just breathe," she breathed. "Where's Declan?" Margot managed eventually. Bia looked at the cup in her hands. "He's here. He's in the waiting room." Something in the way she said it, the pause before here, the slight tightening around her jaw, made Margot's chest go cold in a way that had nothing to do with blood loss. "How long have I been out?" "About 5 hours. He didn't come in?" Another pause, longer this time. "B, he said he didn't want to upset you, that you needed rest." Bia finally looked up. "I told him that was the stupidest thing I'd ever heard. He didn't agree." Margot closed her eyes. She was 34 years old. She had been married to Declan Forsyth for 6 years. She had taken his name, moved to his city, left the job she'd built in Montreal to follow him to Toronto when his firm transferred him. She had done all of this without question because she had believed, genuinely, completely believed, that they were building something together. She thought about the woman in the window. "Who came with him?" she said. Bia went very still. "There was someone in the hallway," Margot said. "When I was in the trauma bay. A woman, dark coat, brown hair with highlights, standing at the window." The silence that followed was the kind that answers question before any words do. "You saw her," Bia said. It wasn't a question. "Who is she?" "Margot, who is she?" Bia set down her coffee cup with great care. "Her name is Renata. She works at his firm. She's been there about 2 years. She stopped. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't know until tonight. When he showed up here, she was with him. He said she drove him from the airport. I believed him. And then I stepped out to get coffee and I walked past them in the corridor and she stopped again. They were arguing. She wanted to leave. He was telling her to stay, and I heard him say." Bia pressed her lips together. "He said he couldn't do this anymore. That she was right, that this was his chance. That if you didn't..." She didn't finish, she didn't have to. Margot's heart monitor beeped steadily in the silence. 11 seconds, the doctor had said. Her heart had stopped for 11 seconds while her husband stood in a corridor 50 feet away and discussed his future with his girlfriend. She didn't cry. She was surprised by that later. She'd expected to fall apart. Instead, she felt something crystallize inside her, something cold and very precise like ice forming in still water. "Get him," she said. "Margot, you're not strong enough. Get him, Bia." Now, Declan came in looking exactly the way she'd expected. Rumpled, red-eyed, carrying the particular expression men wear when they've been caught and are calculating which version of sorry might still save them. He was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize. New, not his usual style. Something someone had picked for him. "Margot." He sat down without being invited to. "I'm so glad you're okay. Were you?" she said. "Of course. This is a lot. The doctors said you're going to be fine, which is such a relief, you have no idea." "Did you know I was in surgery?" He blinked. "What?" "When you were in the corridor. When you were talking to Renata." She watched his face, the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid-fire assessment of how much she knew. "Did you know I was in surgery?" Yes. Obviously yes, the nurses had told us, and you stayed in the corridor." The pause that followed was 4 seconds long. She counted. "I didn't want to be in the way," he said. Later she would marvel at the audacity of that sentence. She had been cut open and stitched back together 20 meters from where he stood, and he hadn't wanted to be in the way. "I need you to leave," she said. "I need you to go home, and I need you not to contact me until I contact you. Do you understand? Margot, let's not make decisions when you're Declan." Her voice was level, completely level. "I died for 11 seconds tonight. I am not in the mood to be managed. Get out of my room." He got out of her room. The next 48 hours were strange and suspended, the way time gets in hospitals, loose and rubbery, measured in pain medication schedules and vitals checks and the gradual return of ordinary sensation. Bea stayed. Their mother drove down from Sudbury and arrived at 7 in the morning, still in her winter coat, with a bag of food Margot couldn't eat yet but appreciated anyway. Margot didn't ask about Declan, she wasn't ready. On the second day, a nurse named Theodora, short, efficient, with reading glasses pushed up on her head, came in during a routine check and lingered a moment longer than necessary. "I was on shift the night you came in," Theodora said. "I just wanted to say." She stopped, professional instinct warring with something else. "I've been a nurse for 18 years. I've seen a lot of families in these hallways, and I want you to know that what I saw that night was not normal. And I want you to know that I documented it." Margot looked at her. "What do you mean?" "The woman who was with your husband. When the alert went through, when we called the code, she was at the window." Theodora's voice was flat and steady in a way that told Margot she had chosen her words carefully. She looked in. She saw what was happening, and a pause. "She reacted in a way I have never seen in this hospital. I filed a report with the department supervisor. The security footage was flagged. I thought you should know that if it ever becomes relevant to you." She left without saying anything else. Margot lay in the dark for a long time after that, thinking about a woman with expensive highlights watching her hemorrhage through a wire mesh window, smiling. On the fourth day, she called her best friend Priscilla, who was a family lawyer in Ottawa. "I need you to start thinking," Margot said. Priscilla was quiet for a moment, then, "How long?" "I don't know. Long enough that she was with him when he came to the hospital. Long enough that he brought her here. The house is in both names. He has an investment portfolio. I have no idea what's in it. He's handled the finances since I left Montreal. That's going to be a problem for him," Priscilla said, and her voice had shifted into the register Margot recognized from law school. Back when they'd been in the same program before Priscilla switched to law and Margot continued into urban planning. Calm, precise, already several steps ahead. "Here's what I need you to do. When you get home, before you do anything else, before you confront him, before you have any conversations about what happens next, I need you to photograph every financial document in that house, every bank statement, every investment summary, every tax return you can find. Do it quietly, do it once. Can you do that? Good. And Margot? Don't move out of the house, not yet. Don't give him the moral high ground of you leaving." She came home from the hospital on a Friday. Declan was there. He'd cleaned the apartment, her apartment, the one she'd found and furnished and made into a home over 4 years, with the specific thoroughness of a man who understands that visible effort is a form of argument. "I made dinner," he said. "Soup. I thought you might not be up for." "Thank you," she said, and she sat down at the table and ate the soup and did not look at him. After dinner she said she was tired, which was true, and went to bed. That night while he slept she went to his office. She photographed everything. It took 2 hours. When she was done she emailed the files to Priscilla, and then she went back to bed and lay there in the dark, listening to her husband breathe, thinking about all the ways a person can be a stranger to you. She'd thought she was watching him sleep. In reality she'd been watching a stranger sleep. She just hadn't known it yet. 3 days later he asked to talk. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The table she'd found at an antique market in Kensington, refinished herself, been so proud of, and Declan said the things men say, that it wasn't what she thought, that it had only been a few months, that he'd been going to end it, that the timing was terrible and he knew that, he was so sorry. "Were you with her when you got the call about me?" Margot said. His hands went still on the table. "The hospital called you at 2:47 in the morning," she said. "I know because they logged it. Where were you?" The silence lasted long enough that it answered the question. "I was at her place," he said finally. I was there. I left as soon as they called. And you brought her with you." "She drove me." "I wasn't. I'd had a drink, I shouldn't have been driving, and she stood at the window of the trauma bay while they were resuscitating me," Margot said. And she smiled. "And according to the nurse who documented it, and the security footage they flagged," she laughed. Declan looked at her. Something moved across his face, a flicker of genuine horror that was, she suspected, real. Even he hadn't known that, even he was startled. "I didn't know she did that," he said. "I know you didn't. But you stayed with her. While I was in surgery you stayed." "Margot, I want a divorce," she said. "I want you to move out of this apartment by the end of the month." And I want you to understand that I have copies of every financial document in this office. So please don't make the mistake of thinking you can hide anything from Priscilla." He stared at her. Then he said quietly, "This doesn't have to be a war." "It isn't a war," she said. "A war implies I'm fighting you." "I'm not fighting you, Declan. I'm just done with you." What she hadn't anticipated was what came next. 2 weeks after that conversation, while she was still recovering, while she was still sleeping on the left side of a bed her husband no longer occupied, while she was still learning to move through the apartment without flinching at the spaces his absence had left, she was served with papers. Declan was countering her divorce filing. His lawyer had built a case around her medical history, citing the anxiety diagnosis she'd received 3 years ago, characterizing her as emotionally unstable, suggesting that the stress of the separation was evidence of her deteriorating mental state, implying that her decision-making capacity was compromised. He was attacking her credibility. She sat with the papers for 1 hour, then she called Priscilla. "He just handed me the case," Priscilla said after reading the documents. "That's what he just did. He filed a credibility challenge against a woman who has documented evidence that his girlfriend laughed at her near death." What was his lawyer thinking? "Can we use the security footage?" "We can use everything. The nurse's report, the security footage, the timestamps from the hospital logs showing he didn't enter the trauma bay, didn't request updates during the critical window, didn't speak to the surgical team. We can show that while you were dying, he was having a conversation in a corridor with a woman who reacted to your possible death with, I'm going to use the clinical term here, visible satisfaction." Margot thought of something. "Priscilla, there's something Bea told me that I haven't told you yet." She explained what her sister had overheard. Declan's voice in the corridor. "If you didn't," the sentence he hadn't finished. The silence on Priscilla's end was very brief and very pointed. Did Bea hear this clearly? Yes, and she'd testify to that. She'd testify to it twice. Then Margot, I want you to understand something. I've been practicing family law for 11 years. I have rarely seen a case where the opposing party has done so much work for me. He brought his girlfriend to the hospital. She left evidence on hospital security footage. He filed a credibility challenge. And his own sister-in-law overheard him entertaining the possibility of your death as a favorable outcome. A pause. "We're going to be fine." Fine turned out to be an understatement. The settlement took 4 months. In that time Margot moved through the apartment she'd decided to keep, slowly reclaiming it room by room. She took down the photos, not in a dramatic single sweep but 1 or 2 at a time, replacing them with things that were purely hers. A print she'd always loved that he'd said didn't go with the aesthetic, a lamp she'd found at a market in Roncesvalles. The apartment became hers in a way it had never quite been when she was sharing it. She went back to work. She was a senior urban planner with the city, and her colleagues had heard fragments of what happened through the careful filter of professional gossip. And they were professionally kind in a way she appreciated more than she'd expected. Her supervisor, a straightforward woman named Cynthia, simply said, "Take the time you need, your projects will be here," and they were. It was work that saved her in the end, not dramatically, not all at once, but in the steady daily way that purposeful activity saves a person. She had a project she'd been leading for 2 years, a community revitalization proposal for an older neighborhood in the east end of the city, the kind of work she'd gone into urban planning to do. She threw herself into it with a ferocity that surprised even her. When the proposal was approved in the spring, she stood in the council chamber listening to the vote and felt something crack open in her chest. Not grief this time, but something that preceded it, something cleaner. She called her mother from the steps of City Hall. "It passed," she said, and she heard her mother's voice break a little on the other end, and she understood that her mother wasn't just crying about a zoning proposal. Priscilla called the next morning with the final settlement numbers. The apartment was hers. A substantial portion of the investment portfolio, his pension contributions during their marriage. "He's not happy," Priscilla said. "He had a lot of time to choose happiness," Margot said. "He chose other things." She heard about Renata through a mutual acquaintance. Months later, the way you always hear things you were never seeking, sideways incidentally, without warning. Renata had left the firm, something about an internal complaint. The details were vague and Margot didn't pursue them. She found she genuinely didn't care. What she cared about was this: on a Tuesday in October, 11 months after the night in the emergency room, she sat in a coffee shop on Ossington with her laptop open and a half-finished Americano at her elbow, and she started writing. She hadn't planned to. She'd been making notes for a work report and then her hands had just started doing something else. The words came out plainly, without ornamentation. What it had been like to wake up in the recovery room. What it had been like to see a woman smiling through a wire mesh window at her own possible death. What it had been like to sit across a kitchen table from the person she'd trusted most and understand, finally and completely, that she'd been alone in that marriage for longer than she'd known. She wrote for 2 hours. She ordered another coffee. She kept writing. She didn't know what it was yet. She thought maybe just notes, just processing, the kind of writing you do for no one. But when she read it back, she realized it didn't read like private processing. It read like a story, someone else's story almost. The kind of story that had something in it for people other than the person who'd lived it. She sent it to her sister. "You should post this," Bea said in a voicemail 30 minutes later, slightly breathless. "I don't know where. Your blog? Do you still have a blog? You should post this somewhere because Margot, I'm sitting in my car in the parking lot of my office crying and I never cry." Margot had a blog she hadn't updated in 3 years. She posted the piece that night with a simple title and no photograph. She went to bed. By morning it had been shared 400 times. By the end of the week she had emails from strangers, dozens of them. Women who'd found the piece through a friend of a friend of a friend. Forwarded with notes that said things like "read this and needed this and this is me. This is exactly me." She read everyone. She started writing more. The blog became a newsletter. The newsletter grew. She wrote about what it meant to build a life inside someone else's vision of a life, and then have to excavate yourself from it. She wrote about the particular loneliness of a marriage that looks fine from the outside. She wrote about money, specifically, about how she had not known what was in her own financial life for 6 years, and what that had cost her, and how she'd corrected it. She wrote about the settlement, carefully but honestly, and the response to that piece was overwhelming. Women writing to say they hadn't known they could ask for that, they hadn't known that was possible, they hadn't known. A literary agent reached out in January. Margot was in the middle of a site visit, standing in a muddy lot in Scarborough in her work boots, when the email came through on her phone. She read it twice in the cold mud on her boots, whined off the lake cutting through her coat, and then she looked up at the gray winter sky and laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of her, for the first time in what felt like a very long time. She signed with the agent in February. She sold the book in April. It was called The 11 Seconds, which was Bea's suggestion, and it covered everything. The hospital, the window, the woman smiling, the midnight hours in Declan's office photographing documents, the settlement, the apartment being reclaimed room by room, the writing. Her editor said it was one of the most precise accounts of a particular kind of grief she'd ever read. Not the grief of loss, but the grief of disillusionment. The specific devastation of discovering that the life you thought you were living was not the life you were actually living. The book came out in September, 14 months after the night in the emergency room. The launch was at a bookstore in the Annex, a small independent place Margot had been going to since she'd first moved to Toronto. Shelves slightly overcrowded, the good kind of overcrowded. A reading nook in the back that smelled like dust and old paper. She wore a dress she'd bought specifically for the occasion. Dark green, not a color she'd worn much before, something that felt like a declaration. There was a line out the door. She sat at the signing table for 3 hours. People came with their books already worn from being read on the subway, on their lunch breaks in bathtubs with the fan on, so their roommates wouldn't hear them crying. A woman in her 50s came up to the table and stood there for a moment. Before speaking, the book pressed against her chest. "I've been in the same house for 23 years, the woman said. "I've been telling myself it was fine, that it wasn't bad enough to leave. I read your book in 2 nights and I called a lawyer this morning." Margot didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "I'm glad you called." She meant it. It was the only thing she could think of that was true enough. Partway through the signing, she looked up and saw a face she hadn't expected. Declan's mother, Claudette. A woman Margot had liked, genuinely liked, and had mourned losing almost as much as the marriage itself, was standing at the back of the line with a copy of the book in her hands. She reached the table eventually. She put the book down. She looked at Margot for a long moment. "I owe you an apology," she said. "I defended him. When he told me his version, I believed him because he's my son and because I didn't want to believe the alternative. And then I read your book." She stopped. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I wanted to say it to your face." "Does he know you're here?" Margot asked. "No." A pause. "He's not doing well. I don't know where he and that woman stand now, somewhere difficult I think, and he's lost some clients. There's been talk at the firm. He's angry. He blames everyone but himself." She hesitated. "He's not a bad person, Margot, I believe that. But he's not a bad person," Margot said. "He was just a coward when it counted." Claudette nodded slowly. "Your book, it's very honest." It had to be yes. Claudette picked up the signed copy. "Can I ask, are you happy? Genuinely happy, not just fine?" Margot thought about the site visit in Scarborough, the email from the agent, the laugh in the cold air, the green dress. "Yes," she said, "I think I actually am." The book debuted at number 7 on the Globe's non-fiction list. By the third week it was number 2. By November it had sold more copies than her publisher had projected for the entire first year. She wasn't expecting any of it. She had written the book to understand what had happened to her. She had not expected it to become, somehow, a thing that other people needed. She started to understand slowly that those two things were not unrelated. In December she was invited to speak at a women's conference in Vancouver. She almost said no. She had 2 major reports due. The project in the East End was entering its critical implementation phase. She didn't love public speaking. But Priscilla, who had somehow also become her unofficial manager, told her she was going. "You don't love public speaking," Priscilla said, "but you're good at it. Those are not the same thing. Go to Vancouver." She went to Vancouver. She spoke for 40 minutes to a room of 300 people, and then took questions for 20, and then stood at a table afterwards signing books for another hour, and at the very end of that hour, when the room had mostly emptied, a man came to the table. He was maybe 40, quiet-mannered, with the particular attentiveness of someone
for a living.
He had 2 copies of the book, he said, one for a client. He paused. "I'm a counselor. I work primarily with people navigating separation and post-separation. I've been recommending your book for 2 months." "That means a lot," Margot said, and meant it. "Your chapter on financial autonomy, the section about not having visibility into your own financial life. I've had 3 clients who read that chapter and immediately called their banks to pull statements they'd never looked at." He shook his head slightly. "You're doing practical good, not just emotional support. That's a harder thing to do in this genre." His name was Sam. He was from Vancouver originally, worked there now, had a daughter in elementary school. He was thoughtful in the precise way of people who have spent years learning to hold space for other people's pain, without taking it on as their own. They talked for 20 minutes in the emptying conference room, mostly about the book, a little about the work she did, a little about what he did. He did not ask for her number. He gave her his card in case she ever wanted to do a podcast episode with him. He hosted a small one for counseling professionals, and she put it in her bag and flew home. She thought about him on the flight back, more than she expected. She told Bia, who said, "Call him. It's been 4 months since the divorce was finalized. So I'm not ready. I didn't say marry him, I said call him." She did not call him. She emailed him 3 weeks later, with a note about a study on financial coercion in marriage, that she'd thought would be relevant to his work. He emailed back within the hour with a thoughtful response and a follow-up question. They emailed for a while. Then they talked on the phone. Then he came to Toronto for a conference in the spring and they had dinner. It was, she realized, the first time in years she'd had dinner with someone and felt like herself the entire time. Not a curated version of herself, not herself in relation to someone else, but just herself. Tired and direct and funny in the dry way she was funny when she wasn't trying to be anything. He laughed at her jokes, not politely. Actually laughed. The build was slow. Deliberately, carefully slow. She'd told him early that she was not someone who was going to rush, and he had said, "I know. I read your book." Priscilla met him in the summer and pulled Margot aside afterwards to say, "He's not performing anything, that's rare." Her mother met him in August and was considerably less subtle. "When's he moving to Toronto?" "Mom, I'm just asking." He wasn't moving to Toronto. She wasn't moving to Vancouver. It was complicated. The complications were, it turned out, workable. Not without effort, not without negotiation, but workable, which was the thing she'd been looking for. Not someone who made everything simple. Someone who was willing to work through the things that weren't. She heard about Declan in the way she heard about most things now. Tangentially, from people who felt she deserved to know. He had left the firm. He and Renata had separated. He'd gone back to Vancouver Island, where he was from, and was working for a smaller practice there. She didn't know if he was okay or not okay, and she realized quietly that she didn't need to know. He wasn't hers to worry about anymore. What was hers? The apartment, fully herself now. The project in Scarborough entering its second phase. The book's continuing life in the world. Translation offers. A feature in a national magazine. A message from a production company that she was still considering. The newsletter which she'd never stopped writing. The community that had formed around it. Quietly and without her quite intending it. Women who found each other in the comments section, who exchanged information about lawyers and financial advisors and therapists, who showed up for each other in the particular way of people who are strangers everywhere, except in the specific territory of having survived something similar. And the conversation she'd had with herself, in the recovery room of a Toronto hospital, in the first hours after dying for 11 seconds. She'd thought about that conversation a lot since then. She'd been lying in a hospital bed, newly alive again, with 2 eye lines and a nurse with kind eyes, and something had shifted in her. Had broken loose and rearranged itself in the way bones sometimes do when they're healing. The old structure had been damaged beyond repair. Something new was organizing itself in its place. She understood now that 11 seconds had not been a disaster. 11 seconds had been a door. Not a door she would have chosen, not an experience she would wish on anyone, but a door nonetheless, one that had opened onto a life that was entirely, uncomplicatedly hers in a way nothing had been for years. There was a phone interview in November, with a journalist working on a piece about women who'd built professional platforms out of personal crisis. The journalist asked, "If you could go back and change what happened, would you?" Margot thought about it honestly. "I would change what he did," she said. "What he did was a choice he made, and he made it badly. But the rest of it, what I built from it, no. I wouldn't touch any of that." "Do you forgive him?" "I don't think about him enough to have a clear answer to that," she said. "I think that's probably the truest thing I can tell you. He's become very small in my mind. Not because I'm bitter, because I'm busy. I have a lot of life in front of me and none of it requires his participation." The piece ran the following week. The quote circulated. Someone put it on a graphic and it was shared 40,000 times. She screenshot it and sent it to Bia with no comment. Bia sent back a single emoji, a small unambiguous flame. In February, 2 years after the night in the emergency room, she attended the groundbreaking ceremony for the Scarborough project. She stood in her hard hat and her winter coat on a site that would in 3 years be a mixed-use community space with affordable housing and a park, and a community kitchen and a garden that had been designed in partnership with the neighborhood residents. Designed, in other words, by the people who would actually use it, which was how it should have always been done. Her supervisor Cynthia gave a short speech. Margot said a few words. A city councilor said rather more words than were necessary, as city councilors do. A woman from the neighborhood association said something that was genuine and brief and made Margot's eyes sting unexpectedly. Afterwards, standing in the cold with a paper cup of hot chocolate, Cynthia said, "You look like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." "I think I might be," Margot said. Later that night, Sam called. He called most nights now, when the time difference allowed. And she told him about the groundbreaking, about the speech, about the woman from the neighborhood association and the hot chocolate and Cynthia's comment. He listened the way he always listened, completely without waiting for his turn. "You sound different," he said. "Different how?" "Settled," he said. "Like someone who's stopped bracing for impact." She thought about that for a moment. Outside her apartment window, February in Toronto was doing what February in Toronto always does. Gray and relentless, the lake invisible under cloud cover, the streets emptied by cold. She loved this city the way you love a place that has given you something difficult and essential and hers. "Yeah," she said. "I think that's right." She had stopped bracing. She was instead simply living in the full, ordinary, irreducibly specific sense of the word. A life with work in it that she cared about, friendships that had sharpened and deepened through the fire of the past 2 years. A growing thing with a good man who was patient and honest and thought she was funny. An apartment that smelled like her books and her coffee and her choices. 2 years of writing that had reached people she would never meet, in places she would never go, in moments she would never know about, and had been useful to them, had given them something they'd needed, a foothold, a handhold, a proof that the thing they were afraid of surviving was survivable. Declan had left her on the worst night of her life. He had stayed in a corridor with a woman who smiled at her death, and he had entertained for at least a few seconds the possibility that her dying might be convenient. He had done her the greatest service of her life. She did not thank him for it. That was not the kind of story she was living. But she acknowledged it, in the privacy of her own understanding, that sometimes the thing that breaks you open turns out to be the thing that lets the light in, and that the light, once in, is yours to keep.